Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, depending on where you're connecting from today. We are so happy you can make the time to join us. I'm Josh Barron, co-founder of Banyan Global, a firm that advises leading family enterprises around the world. I also teach at Columbia Business School, including a course called Managing Conflict in Family Business. I have the honor to be the host and moderator for today's panel discussion, which is being presented to you in collaboration with Trusted Family. Trusted Family, as some of you may know, is an award-winning governance platform that enables families, boards, and shareholder groups to connect and communicate in a secure way. The topic we are discussing today is managing conflicts across generations. I'd like to take a moment to ask my esteemed fellow panelists to introduce themselves. Tsitsi, can you introduce yourself to the audience?
Absolutely. Thank you, Josh, and thank you, Trusted Family, for this opportunity. So my name is Tsitsi Mutendi, and I am a family governance practitioner. I help families create synergy within the different generations. I also am co-founder of African Family Firms, which is arguably the biggest African family business association on the continent.
Thank you. So great to have you with us. Viola, could you introduce yourself, please?
Yes. Hello, everybody. Although I once wanted to become a rock star when I was a child, I decided to better build stages for two reasons. On the one hand side, to empower the next generation to become better investors, entrepreneurs, family members, and social change makers. And on the other hand, to create better forms of togetherness like a family, where not only the individual, but also the group can flourish simultaneously. I could do that in 3 ecosystems so far, as a managing director in Credit Suisse, as the founder of the Young Investors Organization with wonderful 1,600 Inheriting Next Generation, and also as the co-founder and CEO of the Family Institute, which is pretty new from 2020. We help navigate, families navigate through transitions to create new standards and how to deal with responsibilities between generations.
Well, I can't speak to your musical talent, but the world is much better off for this career choice that you made. Great to have you.
I'm not proof for singing.
You turned down the opportunity I offered to you. And last but certainly not least, Edward, would you introduce yourself to the group?
Yeah, so hello everyone. I'm Edouard Thyssen. I'm co-founder and CEO of Trusted Family. Trusted Family was started as a project over 10 years ago for my own family business. So I'm a family member of a Belgian family that's active in building materials. And so we realized that we needed this sort of governance and communication solution, built the solution for us, and then brought it to the world. And so, yeah, we'd just like to thank all our clients that are on the line for working with us and trusting us, and also to the Trusted Family team for putting this panel together, and to this great panel for this interesting discussion.
We will try our best to live up to those lofty expectations. Just some quick housekeeping notes for all of you. This is a recorded session, which means we'll email out a copy of the recording for those that want to listen to it again or share it with those that missed it. On your Zoom screens, you'll notice the controls available to you. Please use the Q&A function to leave any questions you might have during the session, and we will answer as many of them as we can towards the end of the panel discussion. Okay, so before we dive in, just some quick context on this topic of conflict. It's interesting, family businesses are often portrayed as being hotbeds of conflict, and you can kind of understand why. When family businesses go wrong, they produce these public disagreements, lawsuits, stranger than fiction dramatics, and these kinds of things are great for selling magazines and boosting TV ratings. But the reality of conflict in family businesses is very different. Most families are actually programmed to avoid conflict. I can't tell you how many times I've heard someone say when they're facing a difficult conversation, it's just not worth it. We don't want to risk ruining our family holidays or relationships, so let's just ignore it. But it's inevitable in a family business that you are going to disagree sometimes and want different things. So that ends up being a veneer of harmony. And over time, this fake harmony is actually just as destructive to the business and family as the feuding is. The business loses its vitality, its ability to innovate. Family relationships lose their authenticity. Some conflict is actually necessary for a healthy family enterprise. So it turns out that both too much and too little conflict are ultimately unsustainable in a family business. Families need to find their way to some middle ground. So before we have the panel weigh in on some of these topics about how to do that, let's actually find out how you all are doing in finding this middle ground through this poll question. How would you describe the level of conflict within your family business? Is it far too much? Is it slightly too much? Right in the middle, neither too much or too little, slightly too little or far too little. So hopefully you can now see the poll, and we'll give you about 30 seconds and see what responses we get.
Another chance for me. Just saying.
What's that? Oh yeah, see, you're another opportunity. We getting some responses, Edward?
Yeah, I got a good group of responses.
Perfect.
Let me close the poll and share the results. Do you see the results on your screen?
Yes.
Yes. So really interesting. So we have about too much, actually about almost half that feel like they're on the too much side. Interesting. Maybe that's why you're here for this conversation. A number of you that are kind of finding yourselves in the middle, and then about 20% that feel like you actually need to have more ability to discuss tough issues. Really helpful context. So why don't we can close that, and why don't we actually jump in as sort of like our foundation, our context. We're going to discuss a few topics today. The first is going to be facilitating productive communication. And Viola, I'm going to go first to you on this topic. The tendency in many families, as I mentioned, is to avoid tough issues, but families have to learn how to talk about these topics. And what are some concrete tools that you've seen to be helpful in getting difficult issues on the table?
I think there are three things that I've learned. On the one hand side, it's really to understand like what avoids me or prevents me from bringing it to the table. The second is to really also change the attitude that I have towards conflict, because we often see it as something to either fight down or to somehow win. Instead of seeing it as a dynamic process and as a chance to step up for what I want to stand for. And the third thing is to have a concrete tool, which I'll go through in an example, maybe like 5 questions that help me to really break a big thing down into little pieces to understand the bigger picture behind that conflict. I think, as I said, an example might be typical one that I hear a lot. I mean, the next generation coming in, bringing new ideas into the family, and potentially the idea of the son is, let's really create more investments into sustainability and change the portfolio of investments. And having done that 20 times, dad still says no, or yeah, let's talk about that at another point in time. And of course, there's a conflict over time then, and a pretty big one. And what I've learned as the first point to really think about when you are in a conflict, why do I avoid to really dig deeper into that and not accept that it's a no, or that it's just there, this conflict, right? Yeah. Avoidance is very often done because I have the fear that if I bring it to the table, it will become even bigger. Or very good reason always, I don't want to hurt somebody because he might have the reasons, right? Why he doesn't want that. So dad will be very unhappy if I'm saying I don't like what he says. But I think it's also very often love is mixed up with feeling dependent on somebody, and therefore don't want to dare to do something differently. And also, sometimes it's also that I don't understand really what the conflict is all about, right? Where I might think, he doesn't trust me, right? And there's just a weird feeling, but I don't know the real arguments why there is no kind of decision on my suggestion in a way. And so that's number one, to really understand what prevents me from bringing it to the table. The second thing is really changing the attitude, so becoming a little bit brave. And I just read a beautiful article which said like conflict management is a little bit like the art to become bulletproof with an open heart. So changing the attitude, okay, it's a dynamic process. I might not get to the result that I want, but I'm result open, and I will go the first step and open up and say what I really don't like in our conversation about the investments. And then the third one is the real tool, which I will quickly run through. So on the one hand side, the first thing to really write down, if you're brave, you do it directly with the person you're in a conflict with dad. Yeah, so I'm the son and I could do that directly with dad or with peers, to really write down in the middle, like what's the problem in here? And if I have to write it down, I've realized very often with the next gen and families that if you write it down, you do not write down dad doesn't trust me, but you write down then dad potentially doesn't know anything about sustainable investments. So that might be the core problem. And if you know the core problem, you can change it differently how to bring it to the table. The second thing is then who's involved in the conflict. And you might realize it's not only dad, it's also my uncle, because dad only listens to him when it comes to investments. The third thing is what have I done so far? And that might be something where I realize, okay, I thought I've tried it 20 times, but I've actually just initiated a conversation 20 times and I never really talked. And the fourth and the fifth is just what is the outcome I really, really, really want? And that might not be I want the investment to be done, but it might be I want dad to listen to me. And so I might create better knowledge in this topic to transfer it better. And what's the worst outcome? Because that helps me to really identify the fears that I have. And it also becomes by that smaller if I have identified it. So in a nutshell, I think what is really important is to understand the reasons that avoid me bringing it to the table, the attitudes, how I see the conflict, not something that will only have one outcome, but it's a dynamic process. And the third one is to go through the circle of questions, write it down, share it even with a person doing it together. And that is very often much more helpful to make the bigger picture clearer and to lead a conflict into a bigger understanding for each other, or at least for myself.
That's great. And I like how you've taken a complex thing and broken it down into pieces that you can actually start to work towards. And Tsitsi, one of the things that Viola mentioned was about trust. And it's such an important concept and word in family businesses, in families in general. How do you think families can actually build trust with each other?
I think when you're looking at trust, you really have to look at the fact that we are all different and we have different needs at different times. So one of the tools that I usually ask people to use is an empathy map, and really digging deep into what makes us different and unique, and is what the other person's saying to me really in conflict with what I want or what we want to the outcome to be. And then also knowing that when it comes to family, most of the time, the other person sitting across the table from you wants what's best for you, but probably just doesn't know how to communicate it. And so to build that trust, you have to do small things. It doesn't have to be a great show of trust, but the little things that build trust. And especially when trust has been broken, it's really important to start rebuilding that trust and not having the expectation that it will all of a sudden be restored to what it was previously, but understanding that when trust is broken, it just means you left me in a space where I felt that you were not being authentic to me or you hurt me. And just saying those words and having someone else acknowledge it is a big step in the right direction when rebuilding trust, because it's very hard to apologize, and it's very hard sometimes to acknowledge that you have hurt somebody or the fact that you have been hurt. And some of this hurt sometimes comes from someone who probably acted in a way where they didn't really understand the depth of the hurt they were going to cause, or they didn't really think about their decision before they made it. So it's very important to look at using tools like the empathy map and giving it some time before you start engaging somebody in terms of trying to resolve the issue that really stands between the two of you.
Stacey, I really like how you're talking about trust as something that is built, rebuilt, damaged. And, I like to use the analogy of trust as like a bank account, and that every time you're taking certain behaviors that are trust building behaviors, like I did what I said I was going to do, or I showed concern for you, I'm increasing my account with that person, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when I do things that are the opposite of those things, I'm late to meetings, I'm disrespectful, I'm reducing my account with that person. And we could think about trust as something that we really need to focus on rebuilding. We can't expect, especially in a challenge dynamic, to walk in and have trust. You have to earn it, you have to develop it, you have to increase your account over time. So I really like that sort of concrete ways of actually doing that. I want to actually pick up on something else that Viola mentioned about the next generation coming in. And Ed, I'm going to turn to you here. The next generation coming in can be a source of really wonderful ideas, energy. Just the example of sustainable investing, all those kinds of things can be sort of like, that's why we're doing this, right? We want to continue, we want to sustain, we want to bring the next generation in, but it also can create new avenues for conflict when that current generation, the ones that are in power now, feels as though what you're saying is, okay, so you're saying we need to do something completely different, which is you're saying that the way I've been doing this business, running this business for 20 years is wrong. So what are some concrete ways that you've seen for the next generation to actually constructively bring some of these topics that need to be discussed into the conversation?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, when we talk about two generations, I think we live in a world now where more and more we actually have three adult generations.
Good. Yes.
Together at the same time. And so I think from a family business dynamic, it's really interesting because with people living longer, like it sort of changes, I think, the ecosystem. I think the first bucket that we really see across the families that we work with is coming back to this trust relationship, like when you have sort of a sort of kid-parent relationship, it's one type of relationship, but the moment and it's a family relationship, the moment you start working on business-related concept, it has to become a working relationship, right? And again, it depends on the size of the family, the number of family members, etc. But it could be kids, nephews, things like that. And so I think, generally speaking, what we think works the best is the key is to actually work on new stuff together to first build a working relationship with your parents, with your sort of, uncles and aunts or grandparents. It's much easier to like start something new, to work something new, and then create a little committee composed of two generations, work on that and develop a working relationship, because it's going to be new both for the senior generation and the new generation. And so there's going to be less friction. Whereas if the first thing you do is you start building that working relationship in a place where every new idea that the next generation comes up with is kind of saying to the older generation, why, did we never do this? That's going to create conflict. And so I think, it comes back to how quickly do we involve the next generation and build that circle of trust. And I think the best families really invest pretty early on in giving small opportunities for family members to start working together in a cross-generational way. Some families involve the next generation first in the family foundation, for example, and then they learn to work together on certain projects. Certain families have like a venture arm, or they've invested in smaller companies and they create boards for these smaller companies and build a working relationship. And that's something that's relatively easy to put in place. From a next generation member perspective, I also think it's super important to build a working relationship with your siblings and cousins, because, again, like when you grow up, depending if it's your siblings or cousins, maybe you see each other, on holidays, things like that, but it's a very sort of family relationship. And again, everyone has different personalities, traits, etc. So how do you build a working relationship with the next generation? And then how do you then align as the next generation and come with the voice of the next generation to the previous generation? It's a lot more powerful if the whole next generation is aligned, right? So these are maybe two tips in terms of how to get that conversation started.
Those are great, Ed. Thank you. Viola, what would you add to what other things that you've seen to be helpful in channeling this new energy in a constructive way.
Yeah, I think, I mean, Ed, what you said about the next generation and how family is perceived is so right, because we expect so much from family, right? I mean, as a next gen, you just think because I am your son or I'm your daughter, listen to me or trust me, but trust needs to be earned. And so I think the best way for the next gen, and let's say from the example I mentioned beforehand, is to really figure out, okay, if I want somebody to trust me in a business surrounding, when I work for a company that there's no family member, I would also just figure out, how can I share knowledge? How can I build up my knowledge? How can I find a strategy? I gave an idea, it didn't work out. So new strategy, new product, whatever it is, right? And so the same is also in a family. If you want somebody to trust you, like your dad or anybody else, then really figure out what's my strategy for that. And when I want people to invest more into impact investing or sustainable investments or whatever, then build up my knowledge myself first. And there's a great example that I really like a lot, is to not just expect that the family gives me everything that I need for building that kind of experience or expertise up, but that I really also find my peer and my cohort out of the family. So one person I once met, a beautiful next gen, then went first to the Harvard Impact Investing course, educated himself. By that, he found peers, joined Justin Rockefeller's The Impact, brought even his family into that, and used also the Young Investors Organization to really figure out, like, where are my skills? What is my real interest? How do I create an investment strategy? And then go back and earn the trust by just not bringing a new idea in, but also new expertise, and involve also the family members into that. That's from a next gen perspective. I think if you want trust, build a strategy to earn your trust. And from a parent's perspective, I can just say, I mean, 10 years ago, I also became a mom, and I don't know what happens, but in your DNA, all of a sudden you have this kind of control function, right? Like, I'm a parent now, I have everything under control. I know what's best for you, next gen. And somehow I think the parents need to unlock this kind of DNA key, to not think that you need to be in control, but that the kid has grown, and to change the glasses, how you have seen that next gen, and really listen. I think the listening skills first, that is very important. And there's a really cool thing, maybe because Josh, you always say concrete tools. So for a parent, I would recommend from Professor Randall Carlock, there is a communication card, the 360-degree, which I find very useful to figure out whether I'm really listening or I'm just listening to give better arguments back and not to understand.
Yeah, and just to, I think just to build on it a bit, you know, teaching a lot of MBA students, this is the challenge they face, is how do I take what I've learned over the last 2 years and bring it back to my family. One of the ideas I talked to them about is the idea of grafting, which is that if you want to bring a new idea back, you have to make sure that it actually isn't rejected by the host. And so part of it is not just having the expertise, but being, as you said, strategic in how you bring that idea back. And there are some ways that you can do that. First of all, you want to understand, think about it from the recipient's perspective, not your perspective. So how does the recipient learn? Let's think about a parent or a senior generation member. Do they are they going to be happy if you bring up a new idea in the middle of the boardroom where they feel like, I'm supposed to be in control here and someone is challenging me? Or are you better off going for a walk before or after the meeting and talking about it, or sending them something to read? So how do they process information, and how can you connect what you've learned into their modes of learning and understanding, not how you prefer to say it? And the other thing you can do, I found to be really helpful as part of that, is to connect the new to what is already seen as tradition, right? So when we talk about e-commerce, we can think about this as the most revolutionary thing that's ever happened, or we can think about it as just the next stage in a company being innovative. And you can say to your parent, you've always been innovative. It's one of the things that's really driven this company. This is just the next form of what you've been doing for the last 30 years. So how do you actually take the new and graft it onto something that they're already accepting, it tends to go over a lot better when you do it that way.
Yeah, maybe if I can quickly just add one little thing to that, because it resonated so much when you said put yourself into the shoes of the other generation in a way. So if somebody if dad is a person that is very data driven, don't draw a picture about that strategy. That
Sure.
might not understand it. It might not learn that way. And, also there in business, when you look at teams, you have these beautiful Myers-Briggs or TMS things, which show preference and how you tick, how you digest information, how you lead, how you need certain things. And in a family, it is possible to do the same in a way. So I know that dad is a very data-driven personality that prefers to have proof points and data. And I want him to create a new kind of business branch for the family business that I can then lead. Then I better have data on that. If I don't find that, then just use any kind of resources to help him to learn what you're really saying. So use the language he understands instead of my own language, which might be really different, even though we're one family.
Perfect. CT, what would you? Yeah, please.
Sorry, just wanted to add to that and just saying that another way of actually bridging the gap between generations is looking for commonalities. So there are spaces which we have common interests. It could be sports, it could be activities that are not within the business, that are not within the workspace, which allow us to detoxify and allow us to relax. And when we start finding those commonalities, especially during with different generations, and we connect on those levels, it allows us to create that trust platform where we can then take that conversation into other spaces, because we're already in a space where we have agreement. We have, we can even use that space to create examples. We can use that space to find similar ideas that we like. So then when you then try to take it to another space, it's easier for the next generation or the father or the mother to actually understand what the child is saying, because there's already that relationship that has been built. So building the relationship based on something else and based on a common love or a common passion is something that's really, really important in trust building.
So a quick example. A quick example on that, because I totally agree with you, Titi. And we've seen that with certain of our families that have come with sort of innovative concepts to help build these relationships, right? So maybe I can just give a few examples. One, it's more for like the moment your family's third generation, because when your second family, generally the relationships, you know each other, right? But as a third generation, depending sort of where each family unit grows up, sometimes, uncles and aunts don't really know, like nephews and nieces. And so we have some families, they do these like sort of a speed dating dinner, where you have a dinner where you sit next to people that you don't know very well. Sometimes they even bring in external managers like CEOs, external directors, etc., from the operating business. And they do sort of a dinner where like every course you change seats. And so over one dinner, you really get to talk one-on-one in sort of a small, relaxed dinner environment with someone and really build a relationship. In the same way, we know families that do sport competitions, like, each family, maybe they like tennis or golf or whatever, right? It's actually also a great way to build a relationship and connectivity by, doing sports together. And again, creating the teams in a way that, it's people that don't know each other very well, but by going through that sort of shared experience together, they're going to build their relationships. So yeah, I agree with you. I think it's super important.
Yeah, and I think just to build on that idea, this importance of finding that common purpose. In the class I teach on conflict, we talk about different strategies, and that purpose is actually a really important part of it. And the reason is because when you have that commonality, that common goal, it helps to really deal with all the inevitable differences, slights, and disagreements that happen. One of the examples I've always found really powerful is that there's a book called High Altitude Leadership that looks at leadership through the lens of expeditions to K2, Mount Everest, and so on. And one of the things the authors say is that most expeditions fail on the way down, not on the way up. On the way up, everyone's working together. We literally have this mountain in front of us to climb. Everyone's doing their part. I'm not so worried if I'm doing a little more, you're doing a little less. But after we accomplish that great goal, then I start to think about, well, why am I carrying more of this? Or why did that person take more food than me? We lose that sense that sort of ties us together, that gives us that ability to overlook some of these issues. And families are just like this. You know, when you ask a founder why they started a company, the answer is usually because I had to survive, to create jobs for my family. That purpose is incredibly clear. But if you don't focus on rebuilding it over time, it starts to dissipate. You lose it. And then you start to people sort of focusing on their more narrow interests as opposed to the collective interest. So actually creating that collective interest, whether it's, you know, what's the purpose of the business or developing that commonality through sport, these are all great ways to create that commonality, which then helps to smooth the edges out around some of these conflicts. Good. So I'm going to actually switch gears a little bit. We have the benefit of having a global perspective on this panel, and I want to make sure we take advantage of that and talk about some of the regional differences. And Tsitsi, I'm going to come to you first to talk about how do you see culture actually influencing some of these conversations? How do you see that regional differences playing a role, positive or negative, in affecting patterns of conflict within families?
I think culture is a very big influence on two angles. The first one being that with the globalization of the world, we've seen a lot of families become emerging pots of culture, where they're coming from different regions, different religious backgrounds, as well as different cultural backgrounds, and morphing into one family. And then conflict arrives in that situation. So it's really important to just take that magnifying glass and look at the person that you're dealing with, especially within a conflict, within a family. Do we come from the same background? Do we understand things in the same way? Or is there something that is missing that I haven't probably taken a look at? Because sometimes you might act thinking that you're doing what's best for somebody who's a member of your family, when actually from their cultural background, it's an insult or it's something that is taken the wrong way. It's also very important to understand that with different cultures also comes with the underlying characteristics that are inbuilt. They're part of who we are, they're part of our identity, and we take that with us. You find like in Africa, we have this honor culture where everything is about looking at the older person in the room and taking your cue from them. But then you have a lot of next gens that are sent off continent to get their education in the West.
Mm-hmm.
And the West has a lot of individualistic cultures, which they focus on me as a person. And when you come back home and you're now trying to deal with your father and your mom, who probably have been on the continent all their lives, they've never been thoroughly exposed to the culture then you've had to learn and that you've immersed yourself in, that conflict will arise. And taking a step back and putting yourself in the other person's shoes and trying to understand where they're coming from, what are those things that they grew up with, which are the norm, and then trying to communicate with them from a position where you are being empathetic. It's very important to be empathetic, especially when it comes to cultures. And even looking at the fact that there's so many dynamic conversations happening across the globe, across different types of issues that are impacting our families, our communities, and trying to then also see how that impacts individual members of the family. Have they been exposed to that? And what are their thought processes? So having moments within the family where you sit down, it could be during dinner, during family events, and trying to understand different members of the family, the aspects that impact them and how it impacts them and why, and then being just empathetic to that is really important.
Great points. Ed, anything to add on this issue of culture, and especially families that are becoming more and more global, cross-cultural?
I think the key is just, it can become a source of conflict. And when something can become a source of conflict, it's important to just talk about it and to realize that it exists. You know, I mean, I've lived myself in the US for 5 years, and just my experience in the US, I feel, has changed my view of the world and my view on certain things, right? And I think just when you get back to your family, everyone needs to know sort of their biases that come from where they've spent time, who they've been spending time on, etc. Right? Because I think often when there is conflict, just being able to say there is a conflict and naming the conflict actually helps. And the most important is to actually then design a process to be able to address that conflict, right? Because in families, I think often process is more important sometimes than end result, where because there's so many emotions and feelings, because it's family, the process is so much more important than maybe in other cases, right?
Mm.
Yeah, the how you do things in families is at least as important as sort of the what you do, for sure. Great point. Viola, I want to just bring you in on this topic of, as families are becoming cross-cultural, families, and one of the bedrocks of families is traditions. It's kind of like one of the things that defines what a family is. How do you address that? How do you either retain or evolve these different traditions as the family, adds, new members to it? You might come from a different background, or people, like as in Ed's experience, like have these different experiences, and bringing them back to their families.
Yeah. I mean, maybe combine your question with the question before, and then also as we had one in the Q&A as well, where I thought the answer might be also easily given, like how to find a common purpose while in conflict. To just give an example, and that might answer your question. I think what we all somehow learn, even consciously or unconsciously, is if one person in the family changes, the whole system changes somehow.
Mm-hmm.
So also in a conflict, it's not so much needed that the other person changes, but to somehow understand that I'm different now because I've lived, worked, and studied in 3 different countries, as you also, Ed and Tsitsi said. That changes me quite a lot in the way how I perceive the world, and the next generation overall is very much perceived as a generation not only to be big and to be very influential and change whole industries, so also families, obviously, because we had a different look into the world. We could go to India and see how it is there, and we could go to Stanford at the university in the US and see how they learn there, whereas my parents potentially were just in Thailand. And the example I wanted to just use is a wonderful daughter of a very great family with a wonderful family business that struggled then after the financial crisis, came back home, and they had a huge conflict over 2 years because the question was, should we do an IPO or not to save the business? Mm-hmm. And where the father wanted to have the business very much in family control and not give it out of the hands of the family. And the daughter, having learned from all the kind of different views from the world that she brought home, was very much in favor of an IPO. And so how to find a common purpose in this conflict, it was really to, first of all, be patient, because that doesn't come up as one thing. It took 2 years that they both realized that the one common purpose they had was to make sure that the business survives. And that the business will flourish, because both had this strong value to not only have a business for the family, but there were lots of employees included and the whole community, and they had built schools for the employees and all that kind of stuff. So it was a huge responsibility. And once they had realized that kind of common purpose, the conversation was more open. And so in the end, they did the IPO, and it was a very big wonderful IPO, and it's still there, the family business. But I think what I've learned, to come to your last question on traditions, I've learned really that the next generation, even though having been traveling a lot and because of seeing so much and seeing so many different sides of the world and understanding the world in a different way, purpose has become much more important to really decide on what do I want to do, how do I want to do stuff, whom do I want to support, and what do I want to support. Traditions are a very good thing, and they are even more keen on traditions than was probably the generation of the father or grandparents. The traditions become very, very crucial to anchor. So with the diversity of possibilities, with the chance of all these possibilities, traditions are here to anchor and to really feel close and to feel trusted and good. So I really see that traditions are a very important thing, and the next generation is the best kind of promoter for traditions, I've learned.
Well, and sometimes we tend to focus, I think, a little too much on these big, broad cultural ideas and without sort of understanding enough how each family has its own culture, which has been shaped in part by the environment in which it's lived. It's been shaped in part by the experiences of that particular family. There's one family I work with that had a death in the second generation at a very young age, and that shaped everything about the family. They closed in on each other because they said, no matter what, we can't lose another family member, literally or figuratively. So we can't have any disagreement or even anything approaching that, because that might threaten this sort of cohesiveness of the family. And that created a culture that was completely averse to any sort of conflict or disagreement, and that made them unable to have those conversations. And just to kind of build on Faiz's great question about finding common purpose, it's one of the things they teach in negotiation is the difference between an interest and a position. A position is, I want an IPO, I don't want an IPO. Positions are by nature in opposition to each other, right? One person's going to win, another person's going to lose. Interests are, I want the company to last. I want the family to be successful. I want to offer an opportunity to the next generation. Interests are not by nature conflictual, right? So one of the things you can do is to try to set your positions to the side and really get into this interest-based conversation. What is it that's really important to you and why? And let's just have a conversation about that. And once we're there, we can do some more joint problem solving. Let's get ourselves on the same side of the table. We want the same basic things. How do we construct options together and then weigh them together in collective exercise to say what's going to be more or less effective? So I think there's some ways to kind of really get across when you're stuck into this oppositional situation. That's a good hint that you probably need to take a step back and have a different conversation. We've kind of talked about sort of what's changing, what's new, the next generation. I want to talk a little bit about something that definitely has changed, which is technology and the way in which it's affecting families. And certainly, at least I've seen that COVID has really accelerated the use of technology in profound ways. And Ed, I'm going to ask you, since working in the world of technology, in what ways do you think that technology has and can improve, or ways in which it might actually exacerbate conflict within families?
Yeah, great. I mean, obviously the topic is very hot right now. It's been a crazy year with COVID. I'm in London right now. Things are reopening, but with clients in over 25 countries now, a trusted family in certain regions of the world, it's still a very, very serious situation. And so, yeah, throughout the year, we've worked very closely with many of our families to indeed think about how you communicate digitally in an environment with a huge amount of uncertainty. Because if you remember back in March, April, it's like one of these events that happens once every 50 years that can really shake things up, right? And so I think the first thing was really to try and understand what's the impact of something like COVID on the family business ecosystem first, and then two, where did technology come into play? The reason why technology came into play was just there was no other choice. Because of COVID, you just couldn't meet physically, you couldn't travel, all that stuff. So I think technology was sort of a bit forced onto families. And I think families adapted very, very quickly. And now they've realized, many benefits. But I think the things that we have seen was really the dynamic between the people in a family that have an active role and that don't have an active role. Because suddenly the people that have an active role are under huge pressure to take very important decisions with not a lot of information, because the situation was changing every week, every 2 weeks, depending on which business you are. You were heavily affected. Other businesses were, actually growing more. It's been a very intense year. And so on top of the health crisis and the economic crisis, a lot of families were thinking, how do we make sure we don't get a family crisis on top, kind of, right? And so, the first thing, is really transparency. And I think managing the transparency between the people that have an active role and don't active role, technology can really help with that. So a lot of our clients started sharing weekly or bi-weekly updates of the situation. This is what's happening. This is what we know today. These are the decisions we're taking now. These are some decisions we might take in the future, depending on how the situation evolves, And so I think communicating in a format, because like not communicating actually communicates something, right? Because when times are more difficult, all the non-active owners and shareholders are more worried. They start to ask questions, all that stuff. And so, we really worked with a lot of CEOs, chairmen to like have very short updates, even like a few lines, a few bullet points, half a page, just saying this is what's happening, or, this is what's not happening, at least mentioning, why, how the situation is evolving actually really builds trust and transparency. So I think that's one big thing that we saw. Second phase was all the shareholder and board meetings that happen typically in April, May, And again, all of that happened remotely. And I think the biggest highlight there was like, it was actually a lot more inclusive. I mean, obviously we have families that are all in one city, but we live in a world where a lot of families are spread out in different cities and countries. And it's actually very rare for, a family today to have a family meeting where everyone is there these days, right? And now, because everything got moved digitally, but people realized that, yeah, you could actually be a board member even if you live in the US, because, the meetings can perfectly be run online, right? And so I think it's become a lot more inclusive, where people that were further away from the sort of, like geographical center of the family business or family suddenly could feel much more part of the family business ecosystem. And I think that's going to stay, because a lot of families have, then their shareholder meeting for the first time online. They've, implemented sort of remote voting, electronic signatures for all the documents, proxies, all that stuff. And so, yeah, from our perspective and Trusted Family perspective, it was really interesting to guide all our families on that journey. I think the next thing is actually, because it's digital communication, everything is actually tracked. And in the sense that you have written traces of most things, right? Often a source of conflict of families is like, hey, 2-3 people have an informal conversation about something, and they sort of take a decision, but the decision is never really documented and communicated to the people who were not there. Mm-hmm. Again, here, every Zoom call can be recorded and can be, shared on a sort of central platform, right? Like most of the communication, there's actually a trace of it, which means it can be shared. And even if people don't want to read it or, rewatch a meeting, they can never complain, I didn't know about this or I didn't know about that, right? And so again, the communication process is a lot more inclusive. And then I think the last thing is formats, speed, and scalability. So certain of our clients experimented with video updates. I mean, today with, any iPhone or mobile device, you can record a video and really transfer sort of emotions. Oh, this is what's happening. This is this new person. This is how our factory is affected, and bring that and share that, to your family members, shareholders, and board members, right? And so I think a lot of people, again, were stuck at home and, realized that all these tools are super powerful. I think on the things that were maybe a little bit more difficult or that exacerbate conflict is obviously, technology is just a tool in a certain way, right? And it's not because you use technology that the human issues are resolved. And so it's also about educating people how do you use technology in a good way. The risk of technology in Zoom is like you get straight to the point, right? Like everyone has Zoom fatigue. You get into a meeting, you're like in business mode, let's talk that. But you totally miss the relationship part and the human connection part, right? So, some of our families, they start their meetings with, how do you feel? And you just have a meeting where everyone, shares their feelings on Zoom. And that builds just the relationships and actually leads to much better meetings, for example. So it's like some of these small anecdotes, that I think really make a difference. Also, the body language, you don't really see it all the time, or and so like having actually a good home setup with a video where people can see you and you have a good feed and a good internet connection, it's actually really important to make good meetings. So that's probably some of the things that we've seen. Yeah.
That's great, Ed. Thank you. Really helpful in how do you apply this technology in a productive way. And some of these changes are here to stay. Some of them things will go back. It'll be interesting to see where we find ourselves in the next year or two. I want to get to a few of the audience questions. CT, this one's going to be to you. What advice would you give if we talked about sort of the next gen, conflict across generations, but what advice would you give if the conflict is at the senior generation and the next gen wants to help to solve those conflicts? Well, what advice would you give in that situation, CT?
think you really have to look at the relationships between the senior generation that are involved in the conflict and the next gens themselves. Because when you're looking at any type of mediation or any type of people stepping in and trying to be the go-between people, you face the triangulation situation where it keeps on being bounced back and forth and not really getting to a resolution. And you also face issues of then having to take sides when in actual fact you're just trying to be of help and trying to increase that bond. So the best place to start is to look at the relationships. Who have you got a stronger relationship with? And have a conversation with them first and understand where they're coming from before you then go to the other person and understand where they're coming from. And then you mediate between the two of them, because perspective is very, very important in any conflict. Sometimes you are looking at the same argument, but from the different perspective. So it's like that 6 where one person is standing at one end, it looks like a 6, and the other one is standing at the other end, it looks like a 9.
Sure.
Yet it's the same thing. And so you really have to be very careful, especially when you're a younger generation, because there might be other conflicts that are coming from issues that were way before your time, or way before when you got involved, or where this issue itself is not the core issue or the root of the problem. And so really trying to understand the problem and then cultivating the relationship that you have, and trying then to see if you can get both parties to share their perspective before then trying to mediate, or then trying to get someone else who is more neutral to come there and assist.
Thank you. Very helpful. Okay, we're going to go to Susan's asked a question about this situation where the senior generation has created the business. Viola, this is going to go to you, so just pay extra attention.
Yeah,
and then they're not spending much time on governance, and the dynamic changes, conflict happens, and then the senior generation, even though they may have passed ownership, is still acting like the CEO. Next gen's on having a voice, lots of bad behavior. And Susan's saying, I've found that changing behavior is the single most difficult thing to impact. What is your advice on changing behavior for managing conflict?
Honestly, that's a beautiful question, because that's, I think, the hardest, to change behavior. I would say that the first thing, most probably, because you're sitting in these meetings and realizing that there is behavior that is not really helping to create solutions, and potentially also not helping to make everybody feel supported by each other, to create a team to work on something together. And so if you want to create a team, I think there have to be rules set in stone, right? Like meeting rules and rules for feedback, what we normally do also when we are having teams at the business. And I think sometimes we don't dare to do certain things in a family, because a family is always so often seen as granted, things are like they are, but they are changeable. And so what we do at the Family Institute is, if you want to create these rules and also to set things in stone, how to change behavior, it has to be clear what everybody wants. And there might be a way where on the one hand side, you can let them answer questionnaires, like what I said at the beginning, these team questionnaires, like Myers-Briggs or TMS, the team management system, so that the preferences for each kind of family member are clear. What do I need in a meeting? And also when working with a family, what are my preferences that I can bring in and which I'm best at? Am I more the kind of organizer or the innovator or whatever it is? And that will really help you to get not only them to realize their profile and their needs and their wants, but also to facilitate that kind of discussion with them. In the next step, then afterwards, after everybody has done this questionnaire and realizes a little bit more about themselves, that you then sit together with them and really facilitate a conversation. Okay, what is our common goal? How we want to act in meetings? And that might be pretty painful, but I think your role is not to create family harmony, but family unity. And that, what you've realized, might be super helpful to create a very better level of understanding and level of teamwork in this family.
Yeah, it's a good distinction between the harmony, unity, versus unity. And I agree with you completely. You have to change the structure to ultimately change the behavior. And to me, it's like if you're playing a game or a sport and everyone just shows up and no one knows the rules and we disagreeing about like how do we keep score, right? And like who's on which team and what does winning look like? Then of course we're going to have a huge amount of conflict and disagreement. You actually have to slow down before we jump into just playing. Let's actually draw the boundaries. Let's set the rules. Let's choose the teams. Let's talk about what's out of bounds, what's allowed. Create that context or structure in which those conversations can happen. And if that can't happen, then you're just going to kind of continue to repeat the same cycles of behavior. Let's go. There's a question, and Titi, I'll go to you on this one. Have you noticed that cohesiveness in a family changes when dealing with health, bringing families together, versus wealth that can drive families apart?
Yes, absolutely. I think when dealing with different issues, how a family handles them really draws on to what previous conversations have been had based on those issues. So we find like issues around wealth and money are very difficult conversations for most families. And you find with some families, they avoid the topic completely, especially with next gens, and even sometimes with spouses. They find that the discussions around wealth are difficult ones because they don't know where to start or how to start the conversations. And so the discussions around wealth require a certain level of trust and a certain level of mutual understanding within the family to start having them. Then in terms of the health or what can I say, the family relationships, those sometimes are easier discussions depending on how complex the family is. We find that discussions around how we feel sometimes, especially with family, can become a bit easier, especially given the relationship background that you've had, and also if it's parent-child, but it depends on culture as well, like the issue of culture that we brought up. I know like growing up, my relationship with my children is completely different from my relationship with my parents. With my parents, I never heard the words like, I love you, you're important to me. It was an assumption based on, I provide the food and the shelter and I look after you, so obviously I love you. But with this generation now, you find that it's so important to tell your child that I love you and that you're important to me. And the issues of mental health are coming up high on the list. And having faced COVID, issues around relationships are becoming something that we discuss on a daily basis, and we're beginning to explore them with a lot more comfort. So with those two issues, wealth and relationship, which is family health, you have to be really understanding of who your family is, how easy has it been in the past to discuss these issues, and wade into the water slowly. And slowly, that means bringing it up every time you meet, broaching it with the easier topics and starting to make it a usual discussion, something we talk about, something which is becoming easier and lighter for us as a family to share. And eventually you'll get to a point in time where you'll have a lot more topics you can discuss without having a hand grenade in your hand.
Good. That's helpful. Okay, we'll rapid fire real quick. Viola, there's a question about the name for the 360 communication cards.
Wait, I can share that, I think. Oh, I'm not so good in multitasking, but I'll share it directly.
Yeah. Okay, we'll try to put it in the chat if we are still open. Okay, lack of honest communication considered too little conflict or too much. I would consider that to be an example of too little conflict. If we're not having honest dialogue, we know the issues are there, it's there, but we're not actually discussing it. And then Eric has asked a really great question that I wish we had more time to get to about the rational notion of teamwork and commonality, but businesses are hierarchies. One of the examples of my colleague and I have a book that came out through Harvard this year. We talk about the idea of 4 rooms and the fact that there are different ways of having conversations and making decisions in the management room, which is hierarchical, versus different from the boardroom, family room, owner room, which have a different structure to them. So absolutely, the kind of conversation, the way in which decisions are going to be made is going to depend on which room and how the structure is set up. So great question, Eric. I wish we had more time to treat it with the seriousness it deserves. But we're out of time. So I want to first of all thank Trusted Family for hosting this and putting this webinar on. I want to thank the audience for some fantastic questions and your participation. This is a topic I feel like we could spend days discussing. Feel free to reach out to any of us if you'd like to continue this conversation. And last, I just want to thank my amazing panelists for providing some really great insights. I learned a lot. I hope everyone had a great opportunity to do that. And best of luck to everyone out there. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Josh. Next time we see.
Thank you for
Absolutely.
really leading
100%.
the session
Thank you.
and for this great discussion.
Yes,
Thank you, Ed, for
absolutely.
making
Thank
it
you.
happen.
Have a great day, everyone.
Bye.